Well, good morning. It's great to see everyone this morning. If you're visiting with us, I want to join in the welcome that was extended a moment ago. We're really glad that you're here. And it's a beautiful Lord's Day outside and inside. It seems like the songs that we've sung have been let out with even stronger praise than even normal. It just seems like there's an energy and an atmosphere in the room. And that makes it a great time to start a new sermon series. We're starting into a new series that will go on for the next several weeks. And with a lot of series, of course, all of them, Lawrence and I, we try to plan fairly far out in advance, and we're excited to some degree about all of them. But then there are some that we're just absolutely pumped for. And this is one of those series. We're both very excited about this. And the series, it's called This Must Be Stronger Than That. It's a phrase that comes from an incredible moment in the life of a man named Dietrich Bonhoeffer. That name might sound familiar to some of you. I know Sterling has read some things by Dietrich Bonhoeffer. I know Brian is a fan as well. But he was a pastor in Germany during the rise of the Nazi regime. And as he noticed society, as he noticed the German society and really even the German church begin to conform to the spirit of the age that was funneled largely through the rise of the Nazi party, and that would eventuate in World War II and all of the destruction that would ensue in that, he recognized that as he saw this trend in society, that there was a desperate need. The church was in a desperate need for a vision of stronger communities of discipleship. And so Bonhoeffer, along with a team of several others, they formed this sort of underground seminary in a town called Finkenwald. And there in Finkenwald, Bonhoeffer actually went on, as he trained these young men to grow up and to lead and to pastor churches for the years to come. He actually, in that time, wrote his two most well-known works, Life Together and The Cost of Discipleship. But within this sort of experiment that was going on, this underground seminary of training young men, a few months into that, a friend came to visit him who was a little bit skeptical about this operation. And after arriving at the seminary and upon seeing the sort of disciplined lifestyle of spiritual formation and fellowship, his friend asked Bonhoeffer, is this really all necessary? You know, is this a little bit extreme? Is this a little bit over the top? And so Bonhoeffer, to answer his friend's question, took him out on a rowing trip down the Oder River. And so they made their way down this river, and as they got to the shore, they climbed up this hill to where they could see through this clearing in the trees, and before them was this vast airfield. German planes were taking off and landing. Hundreds of troops were running about like ants and doing drills and things like that. And it was, as Bonhoeffer described, a generation of Germans whose disciplines were formed for a kingdom of harshness and cruelty. And so after some time of seeing this, of he and his friends standing there atop this hill looking at what was going on, at what Hitler was doing with this force that he was amounting, he then looked back down the river toward the seminary and then back at his friend, and he said this phrase, "This must be stronger than that. This must be stronger than that." And the two of them rowed back down the river in silence. It's an amazing moment of an amazing man with an incredible life story. But what Bonhoeffer realized was that whatever he was doing with this seminary at Finkenwald had to be stronger than whatever the Fuhrer was doing with his army. That this had to be stronger than that. That discipleship had to be stronger than cultural formation. That loyalty had to be stronger than compromise. This must be stronger than that. Now, several months after this moment, the Gestapo would come and they would shut down the seminary. Several of the young men were forced into the army. And Bonhoeffer himself would go on to die as a sort of martyr before the war was over. And while from one perspective it may have seemed like a failed operation, here's what one author had to say about this moment as he reflected back on this. He said, in many ways, it was a feeble joke compared to the power of the Third Reich. But it was a prophetic seed of a faithful church. And over time, as Jesus promised, that seed grew and bore fruit. Today, the Reich is a shameful memory, and the German church is repentant. But the fruit of Finkenwald, the community, the vision, the work has gone on to shape a vision of Christian discipleship that has inspired millions. And he says he was right. Bonhoeffer was right. This must be stronger than that. This was stronger than that. And here at Lost River, in the coming weeks, in the study that we're about to go through, and the lessons that will follow, we just want to be inspired by that same kind of vision here in 2022. Because while our cultural moment may look quite a bit different from Bonhoeffer and other faithful disciples who've gone on before, we're all formed by something. And it reminds me of what Paul said in Romans 12 and verse 2, when he said, do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewal of your mind. And so what about in our own cultural moment? Well, in a recent survey that was conducted by Barna Research Group, they found that 84% of practicing Christian parents were concerned about the spiritual formation of their children. 84%. And maybe even more shockingly, 51% were not just concerned, but they selected the phrase very concerned about the spiritual formation of their children and the generation to come. And there might be some reason for that. There might be some good reason for that. According to the same Barna group, since the year 2000, the percentage of practicing Christians has essentially dropped in half, from 45% down to 25%. And it's estimated that 40 million people within the American Christian world, 40 million will leave the church by 2050. And so this is the trend that we're seeing. This is the direction that things seem to be headed in. And we shouldn't be fearful of that. God still wins. The kingdom of God doesn't depend on what happens in the American church in the next several decades. But I think even now in this moment, we probably all find ourselves grappling with this. We see this, in fact, this is a word that you might hear coming up more and more in conversation, this word deconstruction. People are taking parts of their faith that maybe once was really solid, and they begin to take this apart piece by piece, deconstructing it part by part until there's nothing left and they walk away. And maybe these numbers, maybe these facts are not just figures on a screen, but they're people. Maybe you're struggling with this. Maybe you feel the experience of this deconstructing of faith, and you're grappling with the tension of that. Or you know friends and family who are on the verge of walking away or who have walked away. But wherever you're at, this is the trend that we're seeing. And within this time, I think what we're all wrestling with is how to respond in times like these. What is the response of the church to be? And I think there are several ways that we see. One option is conform to culture. This is kind of like where it's like if you can't beat them, join them. This is, okay, I see the direction that things are headed in, and so we need to maybe compromise values or maybe give in a little bit here and there, maybe go with whatever is trendy, whatever is permeating the culture, and we give in a little bit and we conform to culture. That's one way that we might see people and churches respond. Another option is reform the culture. Reform the culture. And this usually happens through some kind of like political activism. So if I can just get my political party to rise to the top, if I can just get these people or this person into office, whatever side that might be on, then things would really get turned around in our nation, and things would really be heading in the right direction if we can just reform the culture through some socio-political cause. But then we also see this other one of retreat from culture. And this is just like it sounds. It's like, okay, it's all for naught. It's all going to ruin. Let's just back out. Let's get out now. Let's just go form our own community, our own kind of monastic lifestyle, and just camp out together for the rest of our lives. And depending on who you're sitting by this morning or what families you're sitting by this morning, you may or may not think that's a good idea. But these are kind of the responses that we might see. And I think there are good reasons behind each of these. I think people come from a good place, a good heart, when they take any one of these three approaches. And the other thing is that we probably all tend toward one of these three things. Some of you may tend more toward conformity. On a personal level, when you are surrounded by certain influences, maybe outside of this room, you're quick to conform to the people around you, to the influences around you, and maybe compromise your values. Others in here, maybe you do lean more toward this idea of reforming the culture. Maybe you really do have this strong investment, this internal investment where you get so worried and concerned about the political causes that are going on right now as if that's the solution. And then some of you, maybe you are just like, let's just take a total hands-off approach. I don't want to interact with the culture. I just kind of want to step away and kind of do my own thing. And each of these are a little bit exaggerated versions of how those might play out in our lives and in our interactions with people. But we tend toward one of these three things. But as we look at these, I think here in Matthew chapter 5, that we're about to read from Matthew chapter 5, I believe that in this Sermon on the Mount, Jesus sets forth a vision for discipleship that is radically different. And it is what some Christian thinkers and theologians call a beautiful resistance. A beautiful resistance. And it is a vision that is so powerful and compelling that I believe if the church truly embraced it and lived it out, then as Isaiah prophesies in Isaiah chapter 2 and verse 2, that all the nations would stream to it. If we truly lived it out, all the world would flock to the church. And see, Jesus, in the time that he was born into this world, he came into a very complicated and challenging socio-political atmosphere. The Jewish people were oppressed by the powers of Rome. Their own leaders were wrought with corruption, and they saw this increasing moral decline into paganism. And in this moment, what we find is these Christians, these people of God who are grappling with this tension of how to live faithful and fruitful lives in a world where their values are increasingly unwelcome. And because of that, different subgroups started to form that look a lot like the kinds of things that we're seeing today. First of all, you had the Sadducees, and they went more with the conform to culture. They were concerned about power and influence and still maintaining some kind of relevance within their community and within the larger Roman world. And so they compromised some of their values to maintain that influence, to maintain that control. But then you have the Pharisees, and they were much more like the reformers. They were sort of the cultural police. They were the watchdogs, keeping everybody in line, enforcing this sort of hyper-legalistic interpretation of the law, and enforcing that on people, and even people who weren't the children of God. And they were sort of like, you can imagine, this is sort of like the person who is just constantly calling things out on Facebook. They're just like, the world has gone mad, and they're just calling everything out. This is wrong, that's wrong, everything. And so you have the Pharisees, and then you have the Essenes. And the Essenes, this is actually where the Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered. It was from this group, if you're familiar with that. But the Essenes, they went with the retreat from culture. Let's just get out of here. Let's just form our own little community. And that's what they did. Now, there's another group that I think was talked about in the auditorium class this morning called the Zealots. They went for more of a revolutionary insurrection kind of mold. But here are these three things that seem awfully similar to the kind of thing that we're seeing today, and that we're all often drawn toward one of these three things. But then comes Jesus. And in this cultural moment of division and frustration and perhaps sorrow and disappointment that is felt by the people, Jesus comes to them with this radically different vision for his disciples. And so as he sits down on this mountain and the people come to him, there is this multitude of culturally diverse people from all over the Judeo-Galilean world gathered at his feet. And he says to them this: "You are the salt of the earth. But if salt has lost its taste, how shall its saltiness be restored? It's no longer good for anything except to be thrown out and trampled underfoot." So here's the first image that Jesus gives of his vision for discipleship, his response to the culture, and it's one of salt. So y'all know anyone who like just pours salt on all their food, no matter what it is? They're just like, it's just like they keep going, and you're just kind of staring like, okay, when are you going to stop? That's one purpose of salt, right? To enhance the flavor of food, and we probably know people like that. Maybe if you don't know a person like that, you are that person. But we know that's one way, one use of salt. But more than that, in the ancient world, salt was used as a kind of preservative to preserve meat from decaying. So back then they didn't have refrigerators or freezers or anything like that. And so to preserve the meat, you could preserve it by rubbing salt into it and packaging it in just the right way. And it could last up to several weeks or even months if it was done correctly. And so it was to preserve from decay. But if salt lost its saltiness, well, then it was useless. The meat would rot and decay. And it's not that salt literally could change into some other chemical compound, but it could become so polluted and mixed in with other properties like sand or dirt that it would lose its distinctiveness, that it would lose its preservative quality to prevent from decay. And this actually happened frequently. So there was along the roads, salt from the Dead Sea would become a sort of, would be mixed in with the sand and the dirt on the road, and it would become this sort of white powder on the ground. And it still looked like salt, but in actuality, it was just road dust to literally be trampled underfoot. And so here's this first image of this salt and the preservative quality that it is. But then Jesus continues on, and the other image he gives is this. He says, "And you are the light of the world. A city set on a hill cannot be hidden, nor do people light a lamp and put it under a basket, but on a stand, and it gives light to all who are in the house." So not just salt of the earth, but light of the world. And this is such a powerful image. A lot of us have probably gone on different cave tours, and you know how they kind of lead you down through the winding, meandering cave, and you get to that one spot sort of at the deepest part, and then they have everybody turn off their lights. And you can't even see inches in front of you. You can't see your own hand in front of your face. That's pretty neat. That's pretty cool if you're into that kind of thing. But what if the tour guide decided, okay, for the rest of the way, go ahead, you can keep your lights on, but just keep it in your pocket, tuck it underneath your shirt. We're gonna go the rest of the way back in the dark. All right, that would be crazy. That wouldn't make any sense. And that's what Jesus is saying here. No one lights a lamp and puts it under a basket, but if it's up on a stand, then it illuminates the whole house. It lights up the room. And notice it's not just the lamp, the oil lamp that gives light to a home, but he says this city that's set on a hill. And you've probably experienced something like this. Maybe you're flying in on a plane at night into Nashville or some other city, and you can see the skyline just lighting up the sky, or you're driving into a city and you can see it lit up off in the distance of this dark highway that you're traveling down. It's interesting that in Jesus' day, there was this lighting ceremony that went on during the Feast of Tabernacles, where each night of this week-long feast, they would add another torch to the top of the Temple Mount, the sort of highest place in the city. And night by night, they would add another torch, or several torches each night, to where by the final night of this feast, the whole city would be glowing with light, so much so that you could see it dozens of miles away in Galilee, where Jesus is actually giving this sermon. And so it's this powerful, amazing image of this city that is set on a hill that's glowing with light. It says, you are the salt of the earth and the light of the world. So here's this multitude of people, this people who have gathered around Jesus from all over this Judeo-Galilean region, and they're listening to him, and they hear him talk about this different vision of salt and of light. And the question is, well, what does that really mean? What does that mean for us as a community of disciples to be the salt of the earth and the light of the world? Well, you remember just before this, Jesus actually opens this sermon with what we read at the beginning of services, these Beatitudes, right? Blessed are the poor in spirit. Blessed are those who mourn and those who are meek and the peacemakers. And it's all these countercultural, counterintuitive ways of being that Jesus promises if we truly lived it out, it's the kind of life that leads to happiness, that leads to the truly blessed life. And we can kind of brush over these out of familiarity. But you know what the majority of non-Christians think of these Beatitudes and really of the whole Sermon on the Mount? That sounds really great, but nobody can actually live it out. That sounds like a great world to be imagined, a great ideal, but there's no way that any community of people could truly live this life out in reality. And you know what? Maybe they're right. Right? Maybe the vision that Jesus cast for his disciples is so beautiful and so powerful that it would take the rest of the unfolding of history for the church to actually grow into it. Ephesians 4, Paul talks about this idea of the church on this trajectory of growing into the measure and the stature in the fullness of Christ, who fulfilled these Beatitudes in this sermon perfectly. Or we find in Revelation 21 that there's this image of how one day the bride of Christ, the church, will be so beautifully perfected that on the day of his return, Jesus will actually be presented with a bride, his equal. And that's amazing. And I truly believe that that's what God is working out in history. That's what he's working out in us. That's what he's working out in his church. But even right now, in our own moment, as we follow these imperfectly, here's what I think Jesus' message is for us and what it means to be salt and to be light. And the first is this. The world tends toward decay and darkness. This is the image of meat that's not properly preserved and packaged and rubbed in with the salt. It decays over time. It can hardly help from decaying. It doesn't have the preservative quality within itself to preserve its decay over time. And then there's this idea of this land that's cast in darkness, that's without light and therefore without hope. And that truth would have felt so very real to the multitude that's gathered around Jesus. Mostly poor and destitute, oppressed by the unchecked corruption of their own Jewish leaders and of the powers of Rome. These were people who experienced firsthand the world's tendency toward decay and darkness. They saw it all around them. They felt this on a personal level. But I think we've all felt this too, right? You know what it's like to see unchecked corruption within a community or a country. You know what it's like to see morality in decline while the gods of money, sex, and power go stronger and perhaps even gain a foothold in your own life and in your own world and tear families apart. You know what it's like to see truth abandoned and false ideologies capture the minds and imaginations of a people who are desperately searching for more. You know what it's like to see this polarizing division on this national level that at sometimes maybe it even seems irreversible. You know what it's like to see people who are hungry for a sense of meaning and identity and hope. And you know what it's like to feel powerless at times to change it. And so these are different times, but our struggles are the same as these disciples gathered at the feet of Jesus. The world tends toward decay and darkness. But in a world that tends toward decay and darkness, the other thing is this: the church has the power to bring life and light. This is the other message to Jesus. Not just that the world tends toward decay and darkness, but the church has the power to bring life and light. John Stott says it this way. He says, the world is evidently a dark place with little to no light of its own. The world also has a constant tendency to deteriorate. It cannot stop itself from going bad. But he says the church, on the other hand, is set in the world with a double role: as salt to hinder social decay and as light to dispel the darkness. So here's this idea, this dual role of discipleship, this dual role as the church, to be salt and to be light. Or one other commentator, he says this, Karl Barth, who actually trained Dietrich Bonhoeffer in Germany, he says this, that the church exists to set up in the world a new sign, which is radically dissimilar to the world's own manner and which contradicts it in a way that is full of promise. I love that phrase. Contradicts the world in a way that is full of hope, that's full of promise. And the point is that if the world seems to be decaying and it has this tendency toward darkness, then rather than being outraged and pointing our fingers at people out there, maybe we need to turn inward and ask, where is the salt? Where is the light? Where is the church? And so think about how powerful this is. Jesus says to this crowd of poor and destitute people who feel powerless in their own cultural moment, Jesus says to them, you have the power to change the world. You have the power to reform what's broken. You have the power to restore what's been lost. You have the power to bring love and beauty and hope and joy and peace. In a world that so many experience as a world of decay and darkness, you actually have the power to bring life and light. And I can imagine the disciples there at his feet, this multitude gathered around his feet, asking the question, well, how? How is that to happen? And the answer is not by conforming to it. The answer is not by trying to reform it through some socio-political cause. The answer is certainly not by retreating from it in some way. The answer is by embodying the Beatitudes, by living out the way of Christ. Or maybe we could say it like this: the way in which we become the salt of the earth and the light of the world is by forming a community of disciples who are loyally committed to living out the way of Jesus together for the renewal of the world. It's about being a community of disciples who are so loyally and faithfully devoted to living out this way of Jesus revealed in his life and his teachings, and doing it together. Doing it as a family, doing it as the body of Christ on earth for the renewal of the world. It is this beautiful resistance. Will Willimon says it this way: the most eloquent testimony. This is so powerful. The most eloquent testimony to the reality of the resurrection is not an empty tomb, but he says a people whose life together is so radically different, so completely changed from the way the world builds community, that there can be no other explanation than that something decisive happened in history. The way that Jesus says it himself to close out this section is in the same way. Just as the light of a lamp illuminates a house, just as a city set on a hill provides hope off in the distance, let your light shine before others so that they may see your good works and give glory to your Father who is in heaven. When we live as a community of disciples who embody and live out the life and teachings of Jesus, we become, by nature, the salt of the earth and the light of the world. And so this first lesson, this introductory lesson into this series, this must be stronger than that. It wasn't so much a how-to lesson. That's going to come in the weeks as we continue on. But in this lesson, I just wanted us to catch a glimpse and imagine and be inspired by Jesus' vision of a beautiful resistance, where we are a community of disciples who are loyally committed to living out the way of Jesus together for the renewal of the world. And for that to happen, where we're going next in this series, for that to happen, for us to truly be that kind of community, then there are certain counterformative practices, there are certain things that within this body of believers that must be stronger than that of the spirit of the age or the world around us. This must be stronger than that. But if you're here this morning and you've not yet taken up the way of Christ, the yoke that is easy and the burden that is light, if you've not yet put on Christ in baptism, we hope that you will at this time, or that you'll reach out to one of us after services. Or if you've wandered from that way and you desire to come back and be a part of the body of Christ who are embodying the way of Jesus here on earth to the community around us, we hope that you'll do that now as together we stand and as we sing.